first of all, before we sort of dive into the things that we've seen from the SEC in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, I think it probably makes sense to sort of take a step back, see where we are, and see how digital assets, virtual currency, sort of sit in the grand scheme of things. So right now we have various different types of entities, whether it's trading platforms, whether it's issuers, subject to a sort of a vast array of different regulatory buckets. So I'm about to go through the SEC sort of piece of that. And so, people oftentimes, most of our clients are sort of trading platforms. So think, Robinhood Crypto, the eToros of the world. And, the number one thing that everyone always wants is to avoid as much regulation as possible. And one of the things about digital assets is that it's really a multi-regulatory environment. So to the extent that you find yourself not dealing with security, you almost inevitably find yourself then dealing with a commodity, and then finding yourself subject to CFTC jurisdiction. And one of the new, or not the new, but one of the sort of unique features of cryptocurrency is that it's also subject to money services business regulation, which is a state regulatory framework. So think, from a traditional standpoint, think your Western Unions, your PayPals, stuff like that. And so, you look at Robinhood Crypto, Coinbase, these are all entities that are regulated as money services businesses with state licenses, as well as some of those entities. Obviously, Robinhood, for instance, has a broker-dealer affiliate. But so it's really sort of a holistic approach when it comes to cryptocurrency. So I just wanted to sort of have that sort of in your minds as we run through the SEC piece here. So with respect to the last 12 to 18 months, the SEC had sort of typically or traditionally been kind of quiet with respect to digital assets. They hadn't really given a lot of meaningful, valuable feedback. But the last 12 months is slightly different. They've actually started to give somewhat some feedback of some value. And so the first thing that I think is probably the most important is the investment contract analysis. This came out at the tail end of last year. And it essentially applies the Howey test, which we've had since about 1946, which is how you determine if a contract or if an investment contract is a security. They came out with a specific analysis giving us all a sense of how that sort of traditional regulatory framework applies to digital assets. And then that came out, and also the no action letter for turnkey jet. That's sort of, so if we think about the investment contract analysis as providing us with the framework, the analysis, and the principles, the turnkey jet is really sort of the application of those principles. But sort of despite this sort of good first step with respect to the SEC, we still have a number of things that we don't have good clarity on. I think one of those things primarily is with respect to custody. And that's one issue really affects not only sort of broker-dealer applications, figuring out what investment advisors' obligations are with respect to their clients' funds, and also just whether or not a broker-dealer is a good control location. Obviously, we've had a couple Bitcoin ETFs that have sort of been put forward, but both of those or multiple of those have been rejected. And of course, we have the Token Taxonomy Act sort of sitting in the background that's just been reintroduced as of April. So getting onto the actual framework itself. I'm just going to fast forward to this. How do you determine if a digital asset is a security? Essentially, we apply the Howey test, and it's split up into three parts. It's an investment of money with respect to a common enterprise with a reasonable expectation of profits. That's the Howey test, and this is what the analysis that the SEC has released has given us a bit of sort of guidance with respect to how that plays in the digital asset sense. Obviously, investment of money is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It doesn't have to be money. It can be Bitcoin. It could be any other sort of digital asset, anything of value. Common enterprise. Are the fortunes of the purchasers and promoters linked? So this is when you think about various different types of virtual currency. Bitcoin doesn't really have a common enterprise, whereas in different types of initial coin offerings that are structured more like a security, whether it's a venture whether you're thinking of something sort of more similar to like a file coin, or something whereby you're purchasing that security with the intent that that money be used for some sort of endeavor. And then profits is really the place where the SEC is given sort of, they take a functional approach to this, and this is usually where all the analysis sits. The first two are pretty easy to get through. So the first two questions to consider are, did the purchase of the digital assets reasonably rely upon the efforts of an active participant? So this active participant language is something that this guidance has, it's a defined term from the guidance. And this is what we're looking at when we're thinking and trying to figure out whether or not a digital asset is a security. And obviously the ramifications of whether or not a digital asset is a security have huge implications, especially obviously from the regulatory perspective, but also with respect to, does that initial coin offering have to be registered? Is it going to be registered subject or not registered subject to an exemption? If you are involved transacting that digital asset, are you taking transaction-based compensation? Are you acting as a broker? Do you need to register with FINRA and become a member? So all of these things are important as we sort of look through trying to determine whether or not a digital asset is or is not a security. One of the big things that the SEC focuses on is, are you purchasing this digital asset for the purposes of gaining profit? So if you look at something like Tether, you're obviously paying money for it. There's no real common enterprise. And specifically with Tether, you're not really, there's no intention that you're going to make money. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. You're buying it with the expectation that it's going to be worth $1. So that's something to compare to, as opposed to other digital assets that are really more project-based. So these are the things I've just been speaking about. So can you, with respect to Tether, you can buy it, you can use it, you can purchase goods immediately, as opposed to other types of digital assets that you may buy that are really more funding a project. So if we think of something whereby the money that is being given to the issuer or the promoter is being used to sort of fund some sort of endeavor, whether it's being used to build up the network, or put whatever it is in place in order to give that coin some sort of value. So this is the turnkey no action letter, and this is a good example. So the SEC released at the tail end of last year this Howey guidance, and the turnkey jet no action letter is really sort of the application of this guidance. So turnkey jet was a company that was leasing airplanes. And so you would come to Turnkey Jet, you'd be an individual customer, you'd take a private jet from New York to Miami, or what have you. And they wanted to reduce the issues that they were suffering from with respect to people trying to pay with credit cards, people wiring money, getting ACH reversals. And so they wrote to the SEC with respect to trying to obtain a no action letter. And the SEC applied the Howey test that we've just gone through with respect to digital assets and found that they did not need, or that tokens that they were providing did not constitute securities. And I think some of the important things that, with respect to these tokens, is that they were clearly made or created for the purposes of purchasing a product. People who were buying these tokens, they were not trying to buy these tokens and flip them, make money. There was no expectation that they were going to treat these as an investment. And specifically, they could only be used within the network. And so these are all key factors that the SEC used in order to determine that these types of tokens were not securities. Obviously, in addition to the Howey test issues and whether or not digital assets are are not securities, there are other regulatory issues. Obviously, the Bitcoin ETF approval is something that that still remains. There have not been any ETFs approved. This is sort of a common issue with the SEC, and I think that we've seen it over the last couple of years, especially with respect to obviously customer protection and the lack of transparency. and also the huge incidences of fraud. This has sort of colored the SEC's thinking, I think, to a large degree with respect to their general approach, but also especially with respect to the Bitcoin ETF. And it's sort of a similar issue here with custody. This is actually one of the issues that I think poses perhaps one of the most, the biggest roadblocks in order to truly allow sort of digital assets to take off and to have them to have a meaningful place with sort of the large financial players. So with respect to investment advisors, this is one area where it comes into play. Investment advisors are subject to the custody rule, and they have to keep their clients' funds and securities in a good control location. So typically that's going to be a bank. If it's USD, if it's art or something like that, it's going to be sitting in a safe somewhere at a bank. The issue with digital assets becomes where exactly do you keep them, and are they safe and are they secure? And I think it's one of those things that the SEC is continuing to struggle with. And so you'll see that oftentimes, this is one of the main issues with respect to guiding in some fashion whether or not a hedge fund or an investment advisor is willing to actually invest in digital assets, depending on where they fall on the line with respect to risk, but also with respect to how comfortable they are that the place that they're storing it is a good control location for purposes of the Investment Advisors Act. I went ahead there. Sorry, apologies. So TokenLot's a good example. So TokenLot sort of billed itself as the ICO superstore. So you could go to TokenLot, you could see various different ICOs, you could buy tokens, you could buy initial issuances, and then they were also offering the ability to trade on the secondary markets. And this is a perfect example of one of the cases. There's probably been about 6 or 7 cases, enforcement actions with the SEC, specifically with respect to digital assets, at least related in some fashion. And this really speaks to having a solid understanding of whether or not the digital asset that you're dealing with is or is not a security, or if the SEC would consider it to be a security. They were obviously dealing with initial issuances, and then also the secondary trading issue, and they were taking transaction-based compensation, so acting very much like a broker-dealer, to the extent that they were getting commissions, markups, and also facilitating secondary trading. And so this is sort of just an example, I think, of the SEC taking a position and making it very clear that most initial coin offerings, especially if they are sort of project-based, or if they stand separate and apart from sort of your stable coins or your Bitcoins or your utility tokens and sort of true utility tokens that you're purchasing in order to either in the stablecoin context or in the JET context that we covered initially. You're purchasing a token to use a service rather than with respect to lots of ICOs, especially in the TokenLot example. Even TokenLot itself was actually purchasing a lot of these tokens in initial issuances, holding on to them purely for the sake of waiting for the price to rise and then selling them off to the secondary market, so often to sort of retail unsuspecting customers. This is, lastly, the Token Taxonomy Act. In terms of sort of laying out sort of the full picture. This was reintroduced in April, and it's sort of one of the steps with respect to trying to carve out a usable, meaningful, sort of purposeful approach to digital asset regulation, especially as it relates specifically to the SEC. It's yet to be seen sort of where we come out on this. It essentially carves out digital assets from the definition of security. And and they then therefore treated separately. It also there's some tax benefits. You're not taxed on the first $600. Um, it's I think it's sort of perhaps a good step in the right direction. It's a good discussion starter, but I think it's certainly it hasn't really been vetted by the appropriate sort of regulatory powers that be, and so we've yet to sort of see where and sort of how that turns out. Um, so yeah, so as I've said, the SEC regulatory piece with respect to digital assets is really just sort of one small piece out of the larger regulatory environment. Um, and so while we're certainly seeing progress in terms of giving market players comfort with respect to the assets they're dealing with and the regulatory jurisdiction that they're subject to, and especially market players that are facilitating transactions, that are involved in any capacity with initial coin offerings or that are taking transaction-based compensation. But I still think we have a lot to go, and especially with respect to the Bitcoin ETF. And I think hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months, I think we'll probably see something with respect to custody. I know that FINRA and the SEC have a huge backlog of broker-dealer applications based sort of specifically on this issue. You have a lot of broker-dealers that are applying to become broker-dealers, trying to deal in digital assets, but the SEC and FINRA are sort of generally concerned about this custody issue. And so it's essentially holding things up. But again, hopefully 12, 18 months, we'll get some sort of meaningful guidance that will give us more clarity. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Thanks.
Any questions?
One quick question. Have you seen or followed much around the block stack Reg A Plus offering and any perspective on that?
I haven't paid particular attention to it. I mean, so the Reg A Plus issue that there've been sort of over the last couple years, there have been a lot of people who've tried to sort of go the Reg A Plus route. But I think the SEC has put up quite a roadblock from that perspective. Most people that we deal with typically go Reg D. Obviously, that sort of changes the nature of their offering. But again, sort of similar to the broker-dealer FINRA issue, there's a bunch of people in line who have sort of applied, and the SEC just sort of isn't providing guidance. So, yeah.
They may actually, they look to be quite close. They
Okay.
have private negotiations with SEC, just went public.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Just one at the back and one here.
State property laws? That's an interesting point that I'm just not something we've looked at. So, but good question. Yeah.
Does the SEC give any sort of guidance? So I don't know if this is like law or I just heard it, but if a token could be replaced with Bitcoin or Ethereum, is that like a question that they ask, or is that different? Is that not law? So for example, you can issue a token, but I've heard that if you can just replace that with Bitcoin or Ethereum, that it can be a security. But I don't know, I may have just heard that.
You mean buying it with Bitcoin or
No,
something?
like instead of using your own token, if you can legally just replace your own token with Bitcoin or Ethereum, like an existing cryptocurrency, then that makes it a security because there's no reason for it to exist. Is that like, is there any sort of law for that, or did I just hear that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Why is custody an issue if the token
Well, so I think it's certainly not. I don't think an issue from a practical perspective. I think it's really an issue from an SEC sort of interpretive perspective. So the SEC, I think, has grappled quite considerably, just purely with respect to sort of a learning curve with respect to the technology. So typically, right, if you're holding customer assets, if you're a broker dealer, if you're an investment advisor, you're typically, in almost all cases, you're either holding it, if it's a security, in a DTCC account, or if it's cash, you're holding it in a bank account. I think the SEC has struggled with that simplicity and that clarity that exists sort of in the traditional side with, here's a Bitcoin address, we own and control this. I think it's really a part of the control aspect, because while you can show an address and you can show that there are 1,000 Bitcoin, it's hard to prove that you're the only one with the key. Yeah, I mean, so I again, these are things that the SEC just, I think from a technology perspective, has just suffered with. And I think they're specifically concerned, especially from the broker-dealer perspective, to the extent that they're approving broker-dealers that are going to be, holding customer cryptocurrency or just digital assets generally. I think they're very concerned about sort of pulling the trigger, letting someone do it, and then there being some sort of ridiculous fallout, and then getting blamed. So it's partly selfish, I think, but yeah.
Is like SEC just playing like a waiting game to see if this thing is for real, or is it gonna die before making all the rules, or?
Well, so they released this.
Or is it their regular way they look at new things?
They certainly take a slow and steady approach. I think eventually, I think the current commissioner, the sort of rumblings have been that he has no sort of real appetite for releasing anything specifically with respect to digital assets, which I think is a shame. But I would say it's typical. The SEC is always slow. Unfortunately, it's sort of, I think, by the SEC remaining sort of to the sidelines, it's creating sort of a regulatory grab. And so, you'll find different types of, take sort of a very popular Robinhood, for instance. If Robinhood offers traditional securities, they also offer cryptocurrency, and then let's say they also want to offer some form of margined or leveraged crypto trading. Suddenly, you're now subject to SEC regulation, you're subject to CFTC regulation to the extent that you're entering into margined or leveraged transactions. And you're also subject to state money transmitter licensing regulations to the extent that you're receiving cryptocurrency for the purposes of transmission, or you're receiving fiat currency for the purposes of transmission. So I think it's creating just an extreme multi-layer environment with respect to regulation.
Any other questions for William? Well, thank you, Will, for making it here and